Hello and welcome. We're here in the research room in Longford County Library and Archives, and we're going to mark the centenary of the Connaught Rangers Mutiny, which took place in India in 1920. This event is part of the Decade of Centenaries programme for County Longford for 2020. The programme is coordinated by Longford County Library, Heritage and Archive Services. My name is Martin Morrison, I'm the archivist here. Our programme is supported by the Department of Media, Tourism, Arts, Sport, Culture and the Gaeltacht. The Connaught Rangers Mutiny was one of the more unusual events that took place during the Irish Revolutionary period. And we in Longford have more reason than people in a lot of parts of Ireland to mark that particular event, because one of our own, a man called Tommy Devine from Longford Town, was a participant, and he was one of those 14 who was sentenced to death for his part in the mutiny. Now, to discuss the mutiny and all that happened in India, and also some of our other Longford Connaught Rangers, we're joined by two experts. Over opposite me is Danny Tiernan, who is from Boyle, County Roscommon. Danny is the grandson of a Connaught Ranger called William Tiernan, and you might mention something about William as you go along, Danny. Danny was the founder of the Connaught Rangers Association, which is the organisation that has been very strong in promoting the history and legacy of the Connaught Rangers. He's an acknowledged expert in the regiment, and he has given a number of talks on its history over the years, and we're delighted to have you here.
Thank you.
Next to me on my left is one of Longford's own, Hugh Farrell, who is from Legan originally. He is now living in Longford Town, and he's also the grandson of a participant in the First World War. Hugh is an expert and has a passionate interest in all things military relating to Longford. He is a former chairman of County Longford Historical Society, and he's a major member and participant in events run by the Peter Keenan branch of the Organisation of National Ex-Servicemen and Servicewomen. So maybe to begin with, I'll ask Danny, if you wouldn't mind, to talk about the Connaught Rangers Mutiny, where it happened, why it happened, and give us a sense of the people involved, please.
Thank you. Well, the mutiny started in a place called Jullundur in India, up in the Punjab. The 1st Battalion Connaught Rangers had arrived in India in December of that year, of the previous year, 1919, and had arrived into Jullundur, and they were there to suppress the Indians. The previous year you had the Amritsar Dyer, Colonel Dyer and the Amritsar massacre, and the Indians, the Indian people, like the Irish people, were staging different uprisings and different protests against the British people. Amritsar was where the Indian people rose up against the Indians and burdened things belonging to the British, including 2 banks, killing the 2 managers. So that had happened the previous year. So now in the 1920, the Connaught Rangers had arrived in Jullundur. Their role was to suppress the Indians and retain India for the British. During the summer, which were very hot in India, the soldiers, or a company of soldiers, would travel up into the hill stations, and a company travelled to a place called Solan, and there they it was almost on the Afghan border, and they were there to protect the wives and the women that went up belonging to the Raj. They went up into the hills. It was a lot cooler up there. So we go back to Jullundur. I go back to June 1920. And a guy called Joe Hawes was sitting in the canteen talking to some of his friends. It was Private Sweeney, Gogarty, Lally and Daly. And the 5 of them were sitting there chatting. And Joe Hawes happened to mention that before they had come out, he had gone home for a break to Kilrush, County Clare. And on his way into a hurling match, which was deemed illegal by the British, he was actually searched by a British soldier. So here you had a soldier that was going out to India to do exactly what the Indians were doing to the Irish. So it didn't make much sense to him. And he expressed that to his comrades. And they decided that they would down tools In other words, down their arms and no longer soldier for England. So they made their way to, the following morning, they reckoned they'd make their way to the guard room. So they didn't go back to their hut that night, they stayed in the canteen. And the following morning they were making their way to the guard room to hand themselves in. And on the way they met Sergeant Morahan. Now, Sergeant Morahan was from Boyle, but he was also the brother of the regimental sergeant major, who at this stage was out on the plains at the rifle range with D Company. So Morahan said to them, look lads, what you're doing is wrong. The way you're going about this is completely wrong. You know, you're not going to get anywhere with it. So he persuaded the four of them to go back to their billets, or their bungalows they were called, and they made their way back. But on the way back, Hawes, Gogarty and Lally and Sweeney changed their mind again, and they turned for the guard room. Michael Daly, who was James Daly's brother, Michael carried on to the bungalow and took no part again after that in the mutiny. So the boys went to the guard room, they handed themselves in. The sergeant of the guard was missing. The corporal in charge says, well look, you know, what do you want me to do? You know, this is, I can't lock you up. But eventually, after persisting for a while and causing a bit of a rumpus outside the guard room, now the guard room would have been an open space. The cells would have been open. In other words, people walking by could see into the cells. So he put the four of them into the guard room anyway till the sergeant came back. So when the sergeant came back, he tried to talk to them, but he was getting nowhere with them. So as other companies were coming back from breakfast, they saw the guys in the cell, and of course curiosity got the better of them, and they all went up to the cells to talk to these guys and see what was going on. And they were telling them that they were no longer soldiering for Ireland, for the British, while the British were doing in Ireland what they were doing in India. So that was the start of it. Then Colonel Deakin came and he spoke to the men, and he tried to persuade them that with the colours, talking about the colours and the victories, the Boer War, the Great War, the different battles that they had taken place, including Gillymonteginchie, which was a famous one for the Connaughts in the First World War. And he almost had them persuaded. But Joe Hawes stepped forward and he said to the colonel, he said, sir, all the honours on the flag are for England, but the one that we do today is for Ireland. And that stopped them from going back. That's put a big wedge between the colonel and the boys. So anyway, they were marched back, they were put into a hut or billet, bungalow number 5, and anyone that wasn't a part of the mutiny could move to a different bungalow. So they set up their own guard and their own system. They went off then and they went down to the bazaar and they bought material, and they got some of the Indians in the bazaar to make up a tricolour. They made up 2 tricolours. And they flew the tricolour over Victoria Barracks in Jullundur. Now that to the English was like a red flag to the bull, as they say here, because the Indians, as I had explained earlier on, had just come out of Amritsar, the Amritsar massacre. There were elements like we had here at the time, you know, the Fenians and that. There were elements of that type of protest. They didn't have weapons. And the sight of this strange flag on a British cantonment, the Brits were afraid would actually escalate the feelings or get the feelings going again in the Indians that they had at this stage suppressed to a point. So the negotiations were going on to see if they could stop the mutiny, get the flag down. Now they also put a flag on top of bungalow number 5, which is where they were staying. So several officers had come. Colonel Alexander had come to try and talk to them, and he told them, "Look, lads," he said, "give it up now. Look, let's, and it'll be forgotten about. There'll be nothing about it. You'll get paid tomorrow as usual." But the boys didn't give up. Now that was day 2 of the mutiny. On that day, 2 guys decided, on their own bat, to tell C Company, members of C Company that were up in Solon, up in the hills, to tell them about the mutiny. So 2 guys, one called Keenan and the other called Kelly, made their way on the train up to Solon, which was about 200 miles from Jullundur. Now they had to be very careful because obviously they were going to be taken off the train if they were found. So they made their way up and eventually got to Solon. But they didn't get off at the station. They got off before the train actually stopped in the station. They jumped off. And they made their way around to the barracks by following the railway line, because the railway line went round at the back of Solon station and into a tunnel. And they came back up, and they came up at the back of Hut 27. And in Hut 27, they met Daly and Charlie Corrigan and a few more of the boys. And they explained to Daly that Michael, his brother, was part of the mutiny. They also told them that, and Hughie will know this, there's no place like an army barracks for a rumour to spread and get legs. They also told them that every Irish soldier in the British Army had down tools and were no longer sold for free. Now that was a lie. That was because by the time that Keenan and Kelly had got to Solon, the mutiny was over in Jullundur. It had finished. They had come to an agreement. The weapons had been handed in. They were put into Bungalow 7 or Bungalow 5 on the third day before they were going to be marched down and taken away by the South Welsh Borderers and Seaford Highlanders, and taken away to a camp outside the barracks. So the boys in Solon told the Keenan and Kelly told the boys in Solon all about this massive mutiny throughout the British Army that wasn't happening at all. So the two, Keenan and Kelly, were in the barracks for about a half an hour when they were taken prisoner and shipped back straight away to Jullundur. Now when they arrived back in Jullundur, they weren't put with the mutineers, they were put in the artillery lines guard room. James Daly and the lads in the bungalow had a bit of a meeting, and they decided that evening that they were going to go up to the officers' mess and they would meet the officers and tell them what they were going to do. They made their way up. The Daly formed them all up on the square. Now this is the private in the army, remember. Private. Formed up all the NCOs and men that were taking part in them, or going to take part, or down tools, whatever. And they made their way up to the officers' mess. And they asked to see the colonel. The colonel wasn't there, but the highest ranking officer was Deacon. And it wasn't Deacon now, his name escapes me, it'll come to me in a second. But anyway, he came out, he stood on a chair and he spoke to them. And he told them again something similar to what they were told below in Jullundur, the honours of the regiment, and what they were doing was wrong and they weren't going to get anywhere. So they decided that, he said to them, look lads, he said, rifle drill tomorrow morning, see you on parade. Called them to attention, nothing happened. Again, he called them to attention, nothing happened. Daly calls them to attention, right turn, quick march, and they all come to attention, right turn, and they march back to the bungalow. Now here's the captain, Badham was his name, sorry. Captain Badham. Badham was standing on a chair, giving orders to troops that were ignored. There was a private on the ground, giving orders to troops that were responded to, or acted upon, whatever you want to use. Badham at that stage knew that he had lost all control. Control had gone. So the following morning, on the square, the soldiers did not turn up. They weren't. They stayed in their hut, as they were told in Jullundur as well. As Hawes told them in Jullundur, go to your bungalow, do not turn up, don't take any orders from officers. So Daly set up a guard to patrol around the camp and look after the canteens and that, and make sure that there was no loitering, because they wanted it to be as peaceful as possible. Father Baker then arrives on the scene. He was the chaplain. Father Baker was asked by Badham and them to try and get the arms off the soldiers and get them put into the magazine. Now, in a cantonment like that, the rifle rack would be in the billet, and each soldier's rifle would be in the rack, and it'd be chained up with a chain going through the trigger guard. And they would have 50 rounds of ammunition each. So they wouldn't hand up the weapons at first, but then Father Baker persuaded them, and he said, look, what you're doing now is wrong, so let's kind of minimise the problem. We'll hand over the weapons, we'll hand over the ammunition, and we'll say, but this is a peaceful protest, we're not soldiering anymore, so therefore we don't need them. Or maybe words to that effect. The weapons were handed over, locked in the magazine. There was 4 members of the mutineers, as we call them at this stage, put on guard, along with members of the band who had nothing to do with the mutiny, they were appointed to guard the magazine as well. Because again, remember the Indian scenario. So that evening in the canteen, Daly didn't drink. Now let's get that clear. Daly was a teetotaler. But you'll always get, Hughie will know this as well, sitting in a mess, you can imagine a young lad, 18, 19 years of age, leader of a mutiny, and an old guy up on the bar having his pint, and he said, Daly, fair play to you, you're a mutineer and you've handed over your weapons, what are you going to fight with? And they galled him, and he was a bit of a hothead. And he saw where they were coming from. They went back down, they got their bayonets, because their bayonets were part of their kit, got their bayonets and decided to make a charge on the magazine. Now, some books will tell you there was 40, some will 50, some will even go up to 100. Charlie Corrigan, the Lord of Mercy on Charlie, who was part of the mutineers, he was the man that broke open the chain, the lock on the rifles in the hut. Charlie told me that there was about 20 to 25 of them. That's all there was in it. And most of them had drink on them, bar a few. So anyway, that evening they decided to make the charge up the hill to the magazine to get their weapons back. As they came up, McWeeny and Smith, two officers, were armed, and they were kind of keeping a bit of a patrol around between the officers' quarters and the magazine. And they heard the boys charging up the hill, roaring and shouting and screaming. And they fired shots in the air. But the crowd kept coming. And somebody shouts out at the crowd, "It's only blanks they're firing, lads, keep going." And they fired into the crowd. And they wounded Eugene Egan from Claremorris. And they killed a guy called Private Smythe. He was from Dundalk. Now, he had nothing to do with the mutiny. He was coming back, he was an old soldier, an old sweat. He was coming back from the canteen, making his way to the billet. And it was a shortcut over from the canteen to the accommodation, was round by the magazine. And he got shot there. Now, Father Baker arrived as the shots were being fired, and he stood between Daly and McWeeny and Smith and the guard, and he said, "Look, lads, stop. You know?" Now, they saw Eugene Egan on the ground wounded. At that stage, they hadn't seen Smith over it. But Peter Sears, again from Claremorris, picked up his bayonet and made a charge at the magazine. And one of the officers, I'm not going to name him, but one of the officers fired a shot at point blank range. And if anybody remembers the 1970 RTE documentary that was done on the series, the officer, McWeeny, said of Sears, for all intensive purposes, he committed suicide. And as soon as that shot was fired and Sears hit the ground, the mutiny was over. The boys went back to their hut. Everything that they had set out to do had been destroyed. They were taken, again, the South Welsh Borderers and the Seaford Highlanders arrived in Solon and took over the camp, and they marched them back. And they were brought to a place not far from, about 5 miles from Jullundur, where they were encamped in a compound of barbed wire and bell tents. And in there was nothing to lie on except the ground. So you had all the insects coming out of the ground that would bite or whatever, and they got disease, they got typhoid, they got dysentery, you know. Now, the doctor, Dr. Carney, arrived, and he had a look, and he wrote to the army headquarters, and he said, "Look, these men are living in fierce bad conditions, what you're doing is wrong." And there was nothing about it. And he wrote again the following day, and there was nothing done about it. But that evening he wrote a third letter. And in that third letter he used the word inhumane. The men were living in inhumane conditions. So the army headquarters sent for him, and they asked him to remove the word inhumane. And he refused. The following day they were taken out. So they were basically had two full 24-hour periods in this camp, whatever. And they were brought back into a pre-prepared bungalow in Jullundur. Now, there was several incidents where they were taken out and they were brought back and they were threatened to be shot. There was 20 of them taken out, and they were brought back and they were told, you know, come on, go back to soldier and this will all be forgotten about and blah blah blah. No, they wouldn't give in. So what happened was they were taken to a place called Dagshy Prison, which was about 5 miles from Solon, and they were put into Dagshy. Now in Dagshy, it was soldiers that was guarding them all along. In other words, they're equals. They weren't military police. The soldier doesn't accept a military policeman to be his equal. He's his enemy. But anyway, even today, I think. But anyway, they weren't allowed different things. They did get paid, by the way. They did get paid, and they had to buy everything. But it was very hard to get things when you couldn't get out. So the guards used to, who had a certain element of sympathy for them, used to light cigarettes and they'd accidentally drop the cigarette on the ground, and the boys would pick it up and they'd pass it along and they'd get it puffed that way. And at one stage they broke out of six of them broke out of Dagshy, made their way to Solon, robbed the canteen and got back in again. And it's a great story, but anyway, they got back in again, and there they remained until the court-martials. There were 69 of them in Dagshy prison on court-martial. There was 14 of them sentenced to death. There was 13 of them commuted to life with penal servitude and discharged with ignominy. And the one man that died was James Daly. James Daly's execution was carried out. Now, before James Daly's execution was carried out, his brother was sent back to England, discharged from the army, and sent home to Ireland. And he later on joined the Irish Army. But Daly was executed because, and this is my personal opinion now, Daly was executed because an officer had shot 2 people, Sears and Smythe. And somebody had to pay for that. Because if it was seen that the soldiers had did nothing wrong and they were pardoned, then the officers had done something wrong. And that was the difference between the two. The officers did not want to take the blame for the shooting of Sears and Smythe and the wounding of Eugene Egan. Now, Egan recovered pretty quick about his wounded. I think it went in his side of his neck and came out in the shoulder. Didn't hit any major organs, so he survived. But the officers believed that if somebody didn't pay the penalty or pay the price, then it would be seen that they felt that they had murdered these 2 men without cause. So that's basically it in a nutshell. Now it can be elaborated more, but that's the whole story in a nutshell.
Danny, thank you very much. That's a wonderful overview and explanation of what happened. I'll turn to Hugh and ask, can you tell us a little about Tommy Devine's part and tell us about Tommy Devine's career, because I know he had a long military career apart from his... He
had indeed, yeah. Well, Tommy was born in Longford in Jullundur Terrace in 1894, and his father Thomas was also a Connaught Ranger. You probably came across him, Danny. His mother was Anne McNally. When he joined the Connaught Rangers, like his father, around 1912, so when the Great War started, Tommy Devine was already a soldier, and the Connaught Rangers were one of the first to take the brunt of the German attack at Mons. So Tommy was at Mons when the Germans attacked, and Mons was a famous battle because anyone that survived it were known as the Old Contemptibles, because the Kaiser had said that he would roll over the contemptible little army, and those boys gloried in the name. Anyone that got the Mons Star, it was a famous medal to have, although it was the same medal as the 1914 Star. There was no different in it. Tommy Devine went through the war up to 1915, and then he was wounded and he suffered from gas inhalation, and this caused him to have a speech impediment for the rest of his life. He was an unusual character. Soon after, in 1918, he joined Royal Air Force. This seemed to be a way back into the army for a lot of fellas, and I've came across a huge amount of people that have joined it in 1918. Soon after that, again, he was back in the Connaught Rangers. he rejoined the Connaught Rangers. So if you look at his medal card, you'll see he has 3 numbers on it. He was posted to India and he was stationed in Wellington Barracks that Danny is just after telling us about, in Jullundur, when the mutiny started. He was a very strong believer. Whatever he believed in, he was very strong into it. So he believed in the mutiny, and I think the reason was because a lot of the boys as well were getting letters from Ireland telling them about black and tan atrocities in this country. So that would have been another reason why they were so strong. Tommy, he must have taken a fairly active part in the mutiny because, like Daly, he was sentenced to death. And he was held in Darshire prison as well. But his death sentence was communicated to
Life imprisonment.
Life imprisonment. And soon after he was sent back, and he spent time in Portland and Maidstone in England. But a couple of years later, the Connaught Rangers and a lot of the Irish regiments were disbanded. So Tommy let go back in Ireland. As soon as he was back in Ireland, he joined the newly formed Free State Army here. So he spent a couple of years in the Free State Army, and then he was demobbed because it would have been huge during just after the Civil War, but then there was no need for so many soldiers, so a lot of them were let go. In the meantime, Sean McCone and a few of them were working on pensions for some of the Connaught Rangers mutineers. Now they got it very hard to get a pension because anyone that reads those pension letters will find out they went through hell. I'm sure Tommy Devine didn't bother that much. Someone was probably writing letters for him. But eventually he was granted a pension of 10 shillings a week, and when they went to pay him, he was in Madrid in the Spanish Civil War. And he spent some time in Spain, and he came back, and you hear people talking about the soldiers that went to Spain with O'Duffy were not soldiers. They were just glorified civilians that went out for a good time. Well, I've researched 26 of them from Longford, and every one of them had served either in the British Army, the Irish Army, the IRA, the Civil War, War of Independence. I didn't see any of them that wouldn't qualify as a soldier. But Tommy Devine came back from Spain then, and as soon as the Second World War started and the emergency was declared here, he joined the 17th Battalion, which was a regular battalion at the time, and he was stationed in Donegal. So he was back in the army, he was a boarding soldier, and after about 2 years in the 17th Battalion, due to circumstances at home, some of his relatives were sick, he was discharged on, what would you call it? Compassionate grounds, yeah. And he came back to live in Longford. He was well known around the town. In fact, very well known around the town. He would have attended a lot of the, even though he had left the British Army, he would have attended some of those commemorations and that. He died in 1964 in Harbour Row. They were living in Harbour Row then. He's buried in Ballymaccormack Cemetery, and the late Peter Keenan, you would know him well, Danny, he set up a fund to raise money to put a suitable memorial over the grave of Tommy Devine. There's a fine Celtic cross, you'll see it in the image, over his grave now, and it's looked after today by the members of the local branch of the ONE, the Peter Keenan branch is named. So that's the story of Tommy Devine.
And Hugh, there were other Longford men who served in the Connaught Rangers, probably many over the history of the regiment. But can you tell us about Philip Klein, who's one of the more unusual ones?
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about Philip Klein. Now, I knew Philip well, and indeed Danny knew him, interviewed him I think on a couple of occasions. I never interviewed him, but I used to get plenty of information out of him. I often had to drink with him. And Philip was I think he was 98 when he died, Philip Klein. So he would have been nearly, if not very close to be the last of the Connaught Rangers to die. And Philip was born in 1898 in County Mayo, and his father was a music teacher, a German music teacher. And they moved up to Longford, and in the 1911 census they're living in Ryan in Connaught. And Philip joined the army down in Cork, or he joined in Boyle first in the Connaught Rangers, according to the records. And then he was stationed in Cork, and his family began to doubt, I think at some stage, that Philip had actually been in the 2 world wars. But they need have no doubt about it, he was in them, because after doing a lot of research we found a record. We found his medal card, which you can see here, and the medal card shows that he served with Sutherland Highlanders.
Seaford Highlanders.
The Seaford Highlanders he served with. The reason for this was probably the Connaught Rangers had been decimated at Mons, and battalions would have been reformed after that. So with the Seaford Highlanders, and he was wounded, he got a gunshot wound to the shoulder, according to the medical reports, and that's what drove him out of the army. He also received a silver war badge, which was given to people that you could wear on your civilian clothes to show that you had done your part, but you were no longer fit to do it. But no more than Tommy Devine, Philip Klein joined the army again for the Second World War, so he served in the Second World War as well.
He was a stretcher bearer in the Second World War.
Yeah. He would have been getting on a bit alright, yeah. And you can see his 2 badges here. You can see the badge of the Connaught Rangers, and you can see the badge that he wore in the Second World War. I think he was with the Enniskillen Fusiliers in the Second World War, but I wouldn't be 100% sure. Philip spoke to me about the mutiny. He had been in India, he said, but he wasn't with the 1st Battalion. He was with the 6th Battalion, and they were further up north in India, and they didn't even know that the mutiny was taking place, or they knew nothing about it till afterwards. As I said then, Philip died in 1996, and he's buried in Ardagh Cemetery, and his family can be very proud of his record.
Thank you, Hugh.
I wanted to do a bit about him.
Yes, of course, yeah. And another of the Longford men that I know you have some information on, Hugh, is Michael Riley.
That's right.
Can you tell us a little about him?
Yeah, I'd just like to do a bit on Michael, because Michael was one of the most famous soldiers we had here, for the simple reason that for 10 years he had a bullet in his heart. And Michael was born here in Longford, and in 1915 at the Battle of the Somme he was wounded, and he was complaining of pains in his chest and that. And he was taken out of the trenches for a while. He was tested, everything, nothing found wrong with him. He was sent back in, and he was wounded again later on. And when he was wounded again the second time, he was taken out of the trenches again. He was put in the Labour Corps. This was where they put soldiers that would have been lightly injured, and to do jobs like bringing up ammunition and the like of that. But Michael still kept complaining about a pain in his chest. It was 1925 though, however, 10 years after, when Dr. Mary Farrell decided to send him up. She discovered that there was something there. She sent him up, and he had another x-ray, and they discovered there was a bullet in his heart, lodged in his heart for 10 years. So he was sent to England. It made papers all around the world, this story of this soldier with a bullet in his heart. He was sent to Roehampton, where he was operated on, which was a tricky operation at the time, to remove the bullet, which you can see here. The bullet is held now by a member of the family. The bullet was taken out of Michael in 1925, and he lived till 1944. He died at his home in Legion Terrace in 1944. he probably was one of the most famous of the Connaught Rangers after all he went through. So.
An extraordinary story indeed, yeah. Maybe to finish off with, I'll ask the two of you to give us your thoughts on how you see the Connaught Rangers Mutiny, the importance of it, and have we done enough to remember it as well? I think that's another important question. Maybe Danny, I'll ask you first of all.
The one thing that strikes me about the mutiny is it's the only action to take place for the fight for Irish freedom outside the state. It happened thousands of miles away in India, where nobody really knew anything about the Irish. But just the mutiny itself brought an Indian connection to it, because Gandhi visited the prisoners when they were in Dagshai, and Val Delaney, who talks about Gandhi coming to visit them. Now, if you look at the Indians had a certain amount of sympathy for the Irish, and they took a lot of what the Irish gave and had to offer. And even if you look at the Indian flag, it's the Irish flag the wrong way around with a wheel in the centre. So it gave us a connection with India. The mutiny itself was kind of ignored, or was used as a political football for a while. Like if you take, it wasn't until 1936 till the Connaught Rangers Pension Act took place that they actually got anything. So they were practically fighting from when they came out of prison in 1923 to 36. So you're talking 13 years fighting to get a pension for their stand for Irish freedom, which was not recognised by the state. It wasn't recognised as a stand, and several politicians during the debate would have argued that, well, you know, it had nothing to do with the fight for Irish freedom. You know, whereas the boys, Daly been executed, and the boys from Ireland that actually mutinied, or for the boys from the West, would argue that it was, because that's what it was all about. They downed tools because of what the English was doing in Ireland. So I think they lost out a good bit. They weren't recognised, and nobody felt anything for them or offered them any kind of sympathy or anything. They were mutineers, and that can be seen when they came back looking for work as well. They weren't offered employment. Although, as Charlie Kerrigan told me, we were offered, hands were shaken and we were cheered, and, you know, great, we got off the train and everybody welcomed us back. Nobody gave us a job, he said. I can remember him, I can still hear him saying it. They shook our hands and they told us we were heroes, but not one of them would give us a job. So I think they were disappointed in the way they were treated and what happened afterwards. I'd say they were very disappointed.
Hugh, would you add anything to that? How do you see the mutiny 100 years on?
Yeah, I see it much the same way as Danny sees it, all right, but it probably made people more aware of how many Irish people were serving in the British Army as well at the time, because it was a thing you never really hear much. Years ago, when you heard about the First World War, you never heard that there was 250,000 Irish in it, you know. So another thing about it was, it done the English a lot of harm. It didn't do the Irish any harm, it done the English a lot of harm, in that the regiments, 4 or 5 of the regiments were disbanded. The only regiments that were kept on was the Irish Guards and the Northern Mod, the Enniskillen Fusiliers.
The Royal Irish.
Royal Irish, yeah. And those famous regiments, like the Leinster Regiment, the Connaught Rangers, the Munsters, all those were disbanded, and they were a great recruiting ground for soldiers all the way through. So it would have affected them in a big way, the British, in attracting Irishmen into the British Army.
And of course, the Irish in you mentioned the First World War. The Irish in the First World War were to the foremost. Like the first VC was won by Maurice Dease, an Irishman from Mullingar. The last VC was won by Martin Moffat from Sligo. And in between there was several. And it was the Irish that were to the fore, and the Irish that put their heart and soul, if one can use that terminology, into the fight to make sure. And as you mentioned, the 2nd Battalion, the Connaught Rangers that were wiped out in November 1914, you know, they were the rear guard action to let the rest of the troops back, you know, from in the famous retreat from Mons. So you know, the Irish were a formidable force, and I think the way they were treated afterwards was, you know, and again, if we look at the Amritsar thing, the way that Dyer shot went into the square, which was bizarre.
I think Dyer was an Irishman.
He was an Irishman, yeah, Mayo man. He shot. They shot hundreds. I think it was only 800. I think was people shot. And then look at Bloody Sunday, and compare the two actions. There was no difference, you know. So they were treated. The Irish were treated very badly, even though. And Hughie mentioned, you know, the disbandment in 1922. Between the mutiny, the end of the mutiny in 1920, and 1922, the largest increase in recruitment to the British Army came from Connaught. There was 1900 and something, almost 2,000 recruits had left Connaught and joined the British Army in that year and a half between the end of the mutiny and the disbandment under the Geddes Act in 1922.
The extraordinary thing about it was, I suppose, that during the Second World War, then we were neutral.
Yes.
That 100,000 Irish men signed up.
But you know, Hughie, sorry for cutting across you. You know, Hughie, if you go back, just look at the record of. Do you remember the famous AWOL folder that came out about Irish troops who had left the Irish Army, hopped across the border, joined the British Army, went to the Second World War. Now, I did a little bit of research on some of the guys from Boyle, and actually there was a family where my mother and father were living when they came to Boyle. The family before them, their father had gone off to the Second World War. Most of the guys that the Irish Army used the word deserted. The Irish Army. Most of the guys that left the Irish Army and joined the British Army during the time of the beginning of the Second World War also had connections to soldiers prior to 1922, to British regiments. Their families had. There was a long connection there and a long history.
And I think that is true of a number of Longford soldiers, those who served in the British Army. Some of them went on to have careers in maybe the Irish Army later on, and some of them came from military families where you could have had 2 or 3 generations. Am I right in saying
that's
that?
Right. There was a great one there. Martin O'Connor gave me a story about Dermody from Portendring, and he joined the Chindits, but he was in the Irish Army. He was a sergeant here in the Irish Army in 1939, and himself and half the platoon left and went to England and joined the Liverpool regiment. They were the crowd that made up most of the Chindits.
Yeah.
He ended up on the 2 Chindit expeditions in Burma. He was one of the only few soldiers that did, because he was supposed to be a great man to handle mules and horses and that, and he was also a great jungle fighter. But he was wounded at a place called Pagoda Hill in Burma, and he died in India. He's buried in India.
There are nearly, one could say, nearly more soldiers, more men from Ireland buried on foreign soil than there are soldiers buried here.
It's a good show, man. Yeah. We have 3 in India anyway. 2 from the First World War, and your man, and probably more if we only knew.
Yeah, I was just going to say more like soldiers. They could bring their wives with them when they went. Like my grandfather and grandmother were in India. I have an aunt and an uncle that were born in Jaipur and I can't think of the name of the other place. Jaipur was one, and
Jullundur.
No, it wasn't Jullundur. No, and they were born out there, and they were educated out there, and I have a book that my aunt gave me. It's on geography, and it's stamped inside library of the Connaught Rangers School.
That's a good one.
Extraordinary, amazing.
So the cantonment was where they lived was actually it was a little city within a city, or a town within a city, because it was bigger than the village.
Right. Yes.
You know, because you could have 8,000 or 9,000 people.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, in one of those the cantonment, especially in Jullundur, that was a massive place altogether. You know, and it's actually from Jullundur that Dyer came. That Dyer left Jullundur to go down to Amritsar for the massacre. He marched his
Where did you say he was from?
I think it's from Mayo.
Mayo, right? Yeah, there was a
I,
lot
I,
from
I,
Mayo
I'd,
and,
se- yeah, I'd send you the.
I knew
if
he
I'm
was
wrong,
Irish,
yeah.
all right.
Yeah. Actually, I think I said Victoria Barracks at one stage. It was actually Wellington Barracks.
It was Wellington
Barracks. Yeah,
Barracks,
sorry
yeah.
about that. Yeah.
No one is going to know his that.
No.
I don't think Wellington.
But when my grandfather joined in 1897, he paid his way on a ship, stoking coal into the engine to Scotland, and he went to Hamilton and he joined the Connaughts were stationed there at the time, the 88th Foot, the 1st Battalion, and he joined them there. And to this day, we have somebody without a break in both the British Army and the Irish Army.
Right.
I have my cousin's son is a captain in the British Army, and my own son is in the Air Corps. So,
Yes, yeah.
and that's without a break, and
Yeah.
that's the type of history that has come from.
Yes.
They said the first taking of the Queen Shilling, with the King
Well, I
Shilling.
suppose the Connaught Rangers would have been the second most popular regiment here in Longford
Yeah,
after the Leinster
Leinster,
regiment.
I would think so, yes.
Because we had Big Jack
Yes.
McCormick as well. Remember Big
yes,
Jack
you
McCormick,
mentioned
the
him before,
bandsman?
Hugh,
yes. Yeah.
And he was in India as well.
Yeah.
He joined up when he was 12 because he joined up as a bandsman.
Yeah,
And he was in the Connaught Rangers then all his life, Jack.
but I think the Rangers actually were the regiment that put the Irish fighting troops on the map. And they're not taken from the Leinsters or the Munsters, the South Irish Horse or whatever. But they were a formidable fighting force, and they came from the west coast, and there was very little food, there was very little employment, and that was their only option, and that came.
Well,
but they did get an education, and they did get a trade.
The reason for the west of Ireland, well, a lot of them would have joined the Connaught Rangers, it was handy anyway.
Yeah.
And here it was the Leinsters because they were in Crinkle
In Burr.
In Burr,
Burr,
yeah,
yeah. And you could join them in Athlone or Mullingar as well and be
Yeah.
sent on, you see.
Yeah, I have the records of the Boer. I gave them to them in Mullingar. I have the records of the medal roll for the Boer War coming back to Mullingar,
Yeah.
where they got their medals.
There is several photographs. Now, I have photographs of the Connaughts in Mullingar if you want them.
Yeah,
I have them.
yeah, sometime, yeah.
Well, maybe to conclude, I want to thank Danny and Hugh because we've had a fascinating discussion, and the two of you have extraordinary knowledge of the subject and the personalities, and of course the personalities are what make any historical event, and the people and what motivates them. They're the things that we really have to try and look into and understand. So I want to thank you very much for taking part in our discussion this morning. There are two final things that I'll say before we conclude. One of them is that here in Longford, over the last probably 7 years at this stage, we've been trying to gather as much information as possible on the local men who served, particularly in the First World War, but also in various other armed forces. And we're using our Longford at War website and directory, which is our way of appealing to the world, so to speak, and asking members of the public to submit information on their relatives who would have served in various forces. And Hugh has been instrumental in helping us with that. And Danny, would you want to come in
I
on
just
that?
cordially like to invite both of you to Tubbercurry on the 2nd of November, where a plaque has been unveiled by the President, Michael D. Higgins, to the mutineers. And it's a very historic occasion. It's the 100th anniversary, and the people in Tubbercurry or Sligo who had 4 members that were involved in the mutiny are putting up a plaque in the square where James Gorman came from to the mutineers, and I'd like to invite you to come down to that and celebrate
Thank you
with
very
us.
much, Danny. We appreciate that very much, and we know that was postponed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was due to have taken place.
It was due to take place on the 17th of July, the anniversary of the start of the mutiny.
Right.
But now the President has asked that we put it back to November, the 2nd of November, which is actually the 100th anniversary of the execution of James Daly.
Okay.
And James Daly was the last soldier to be executed by the British Army.
That's right, yeah.
Extraordinary. It's important that we commemorate him, and
Yes.
that the Irish state will commemorate those who were involved.
Well, you're welcome to come down and join us.
Thank you.
And Martin, of course, you know that James Daly had a great connection to here.
Explain that, Hugh, please.
He got married to a woman, I think she was Alan, I'm not too sure, but Danny is meeting some of the relatives later, and he died in Drumlish, and he fought all his battle about trying to get a pension for his son for the memory of his son from Drumlish.
For the two of them.
It was his father who
It
was
was his
married.
father, yeah.
Right,
His
yes,
father is
yes.
buried in Drumlish.
It was his father's second marriage, isn't that right?
His father's second
Right,
marriage,
okay,
yeah.
yes.
The mother died young when
Yeah.
James and Michael were young.
And his funeral details are on the pension thing. How much his funeral cost. His wife carried on the fight and she put up how much this man's funeral cost in Drumlish
Okay.
and a list of all the items and how much each
Okay.
item was.
Amazing. Again, that shows the struggle that the families sometimes had to continue on with after the loss of a loved one who was.
Just talking on pensions, Smith, that wasn't involved in the mutiny but was shot and so on. His family had an awful fight and they never got a pension.
Really.
And they should have got a
They
British
should have got
Army
a British pension.
Yeah.
Yeah, the British Army told him go to the Irish government because that's what he died for, fight for Irish freedom. He didn't, he wasn't involved in the mutiny at all. He had nothing to do with it.
Okay.
So.
Well, the final point I'll make is that this event is being held as part of Heritage Week 2020, and I want to acknowledge the support of Maria Keneally, our Heritage Officer, and encourage all of you to tune into some of our other Heritage Week events, and also to continue to check our website www.longfordlibrary.ie for our Decade of Centenaries commemorative events over the remainder of this year and into 2021. Thank you.